Cush lies on the western slopes of Sliabh Riagh. It is an area steeped in mythology, and this drew Sliabh Riagh, Professor of Archaeology in UCC, to investigate Cush. The excavation took place over 2 seasons in 1934 and 35. It was the first large-scale modern archaeological excavation undertaken by an Irish university. What Professor Riagh and his team uncovered revealed 3,000 years of life and death on the slopes of Cush, and we will briefly discuss some of his discoveries now. In the Western Field, Professor Riagh found a kist burial. A kist burial is a Bronze Age type of burial. They are a pit in the ground, lined with stone, and in it you could find the remains of a skeleton or cremation burials. Now unfortunately none of the bone has survived because the ground is very acidic, but what we do have, and what we can date the Hill of Cush from, is we have food vessel pottery remains that are dated to around 2000 BC to 1800 BC. So that's the early Bronze Age, and that's the earliest date we have for people living on the Hill of Cush. Of course, then we have the mounds, the tumuli, which in turn have a long history. Not only have you made Bronze Age burials, but you also have later Iron Age burials added into it. We think that they picked the site on Cush, which, as you can see, is not always favourable. You're facing west downhill, and as the early medieval period went on and the trees were cut, there was more erosion and less shelter, and it was pretty windy, and the doors had to face downhill for drainage, so that's facing west, not the favourable south and east. So there are a lot of reasons why not to pick the site, but why they picked the site, why it meant so much to the people that they would actually set up their settlements here and build all those ring forts, is that it held symbolic or cultural importance by virtue of the fact that you had important Bronze Age burials here that represented connections to the ancestors and a claim to the Hill of Cush and perhaps further into the Golden Vale. They built their ring forts on top of and beside earlier Bronze Age burials, claiming this land on behalf of the ancestors. We can see that clearly in ring fort number 5, in the centre of which was excavated 5 Middle Bronze Age burials. The people who lived in the ring forts were mostly farmers, and cattle was their main form of produce. And from cattle they also had the dairy products like milk, cheese and butter. In fact, garlic butter seems to be a particular favourite among the early medieval Irish. What we see now up in Cush is that they divided the fields into long rectangular fields facing downslope, similar to the fields we'd see today. What is particularly interesting about Cush is that the bank and ditch system in those rectangular fields, which face down west, downslope, they correspond almost exactly with the 8th century Brehon laws, the Breha Comachasa, which basically means the laws of neighbourhood, meaning that they have the correct bank and ditches that should be between neighbours' fields. And this was the system of strip grazing that they appear to have used, and that we see in the old laws, and now we have, even today, still remaining in the field systems up in the hillside of Cush. It still hasn't changed. What also they used to farm and produce is we've the bones of both sheep and pigs. And again, pigs would be a good diet for, particularly in the winter, and producing their young in the autumn. And then also they produce crops from which they'd make maybe bread and perhaps beer as well. This would be oats and barley. Wheat was not very suitable in the climate of the time, as it needs a dry, warm climate, whereas particularly oats was very, very useful for a climate such as Ireland at the time, which would have been wet and rather cold. All but one of the ring forts had a souterrain associated with it. A souterrain is an underground tunnel roofed and walled by stone slabs. They could be used as a sort of fridge to store dairy products in a cool environment, and also as a place of refuge in the event of an attack. In this last case, we find Bronze Age reproductions made from the clay of Cush by Elaine Lynch. There was no carbon-14 dating technique in Sliabh Riagh's time. This pottery typology dates the early part of Cush. Here we have food vessels from the early Bronze Age, that's around 2000 BC to 1800 BC. Two of them were found in a kist in the Western Field, where the cremated bodies of a young adult and a child were recovered. They were grave goods, possibly containing food for the journey to the other world. These are cordon urns. They date to the Middle Bronze Age, around 1600 BC to 1300 BC. They are so called from narrow cords set around their middle. They are larger than the earlier food vessels, and unlike them, the cordon urns contained cremated human bone, often of young adults and teenagers. The decoration is mostly kept to the part between the rim and the cord. Pygmy cups often accompany cordon-urned burials. They are sometimes called incense cups, as they are thought to contain some burnable substance. This handled pygmy cup is a particularly fine example. The significance of Cush is that it represents 3,000 years of settlement, from the early Bronze Age to around the 12th century AD. The earlier prehistoric burials brought prestige to the medieval people who built the ring forts next to them. Sliabh Riagh's excavation was the first major archaeological undertaking by the young Irish state. Its success can be measured by the fact that so many years later, the results of the Cush excavations can still be studied and assessed today.